When you start noticing someone more than before, there is a very specific moment when it begins. It is not dramatic. There is no announcement, no clear event, nothing that would stand out if someone else were watching from the outside. It begins as a small internal shift. You realize that your attention is returning to someone more often than it used to, not in a loud or obsessive way, but in a quiet, persistent way. Your focus drifts back to them without effort. You notice details you would have ignored before, their expressions, their timing, the way they speak, or the way they react to certain things start to register. Their presence lingers longer in your awareness than it logically should. And even when nothing obvious is happening between you, something feels active beneath the surface, as if a background awareness has switched. On asterisk, what is interesting is that this rarely begins with attraction in the obvious sense. It does not always start with desire, fantasy, or conscious intention. More often, it starts with meaning quietly attaching itself to a person who previously felt neutral or interchangeable. Once that happens, the way your mind relates to them begins to change. At first, it feels almost accidental. You replay a small interaction, a glance that lasted a fraction longer than expected, a comment that landed deeper than you anticipated. Something about how they responded to you felt different, more personal, more precise, more real. Your mind flags the moment without offering a clear explanation. Not because it was intense, but because it did not feel generic, did not feel replaceable. That is usually the first real shift. Asterisk, at that point, the person stops feeling like one of many and starts feeling specific. Specificity is powerful because once someone becomes specific in your mind, your attention reorganizes itself around them. You begin to notice patterns in how they behave. You remember small things they say. You start anticipating how they might respond, even when they are not present. This is not obsession yet. It is alignment. Your brain is trying to understand why this person suddenly feels relevant to your internal world. It is searching for emotional logic. It is attempting to map significance. Asterisk, what happens next is subtle but important. You begin to assign emotional weight to moments that would normally feel neutral. Silence carries a different tone. Absence feels louder than it should. You notice when they enter a space and when they leave it. Even if you tell yourself you do not consciously care, part of you does care, even if that part stays quiet. And that part does not want answers yet. It wants to preserve the feeling as it is, undefined but alive. Asterisk, this is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They assume that noticing someone more means attraction is growing in a straight, predictable line. They believe they are catching feelings in a familiar way. But what is actually happening is more layered. Your mind is testing emotional significance. It is asking whether this person affects you, whether they disrupt your emotional baseline, whether they register in a way others do not. The answer continues to come back as yes. Your attention deepens without your permission. You do not choose to care more. You discover that you already do. Asterisk, that discovery can feel surprisingly quiet or subtly unsettling. Once someone occupies more mental space, you lose a degree of emotional neutrality. You are no longer detached. You are invested enough for outcomes to matter, even if you wish they did not. That is when internal tension begins. You become more aware of how you show up around them. Not in an exaggerated or performative way at first, but in a calibrating way. You notice when you feel relaxed, when you feel guarded, when you are trying slightly more or slightly less. You may replay conversations afterward, not because they were dramatic, but because you want to understand what tone was set, what subtext was exchanged, and whether anything subtly moved forward or remained unresolved. Asterisk, the mind does not replay meaningless interactions. It replays moments where emotional direction feels unclear. At this stage, noticing becomes directional. You are no longer simply observing the person. You are tracking movement. You are sensing whether the dynamic is warming or cooling, whether They are leaning in or remaining neutral, whether a moment created closeness or distance. Even when nothing is being said out loud, something is being measured internally. Asterisk. This is where people often make the mistake of acting too early or explaining the feeling to themselves too quickly. They label it as attraction, attachment, or interest and then attempt to manage it. But labeling does not dissolve the feeling. In many cases, premature interpretation intensifies it. Once a label exists, the feeling gains a story. And once there is a story, the mind starts looking for confirmation. A smile becomes significant. A delayed response feels loaded. Small shifts are magnified. The other person may not have changed much at all. What has changed is your lens. That lens is shaped by uncertainty. Asterisk uncertainty is what keeps attention alive. When something feels predictable, the mind relaxes. When something feels unresolved, the mind stays engaged. That is why noticing someone more is often less about how good the interactions feel and more about how open-ended they are. There is something unfinished, something that has not settled into clarity. And clarity, whether people consciously realize it or not, is what the mind is always moving toward. Asterisk as this continues. The emotional experience deepens, not through intensity, but through contrast. Moments with them feel slightly elevated. Moments without them feel flatter. You may not miss them in an obvious way, but you notice the difference when they are not around. That difference becomes a reference point. And once someone becomes a reference point in your emotional system, they matter. Asterisk at this stage. Your emotional system begins to protect the connection before it is even defined. You become more careful, more observant, and less impulsive. You hesitate before saying certain things. You hold back in small, almost unconscious ways, not out of fear, but out of preservation. You do not want to disrupt the dynamic before you understand it. This is where the experience diverges based on emotional grounding. If you are comfortable with uncertainty, the noticing remains light, curious, and open. You allow the dynamic to reveal itself naturally over time. If you are not comfortable with uncertainty, the mind tries to resolve the tension prematurely. You search for signals, reassurance, and meaning. You may push subtly or pull back abruptly just to feel something shift. Asterisk the noticing itself is not the problem. The pressure to do something about it is. This is where a male-specific experience often appears, though not in the way people usually expect. For many men, noticing someone more triggers a quiet sense of responsibility. There is an internal belief that if interest exists, action should follow. That ambiguity must be resolved. That clarity must be created. Not because this is objectively true, but because uncertainty feels like a loss of control. As a result, noticing becomes charged. Instead of remaining an observation, it turns into a question. What am I supposed to do with this feeling? That question can distort the experience. The noticing phase is not a call to act. It is a signal to pay attention and understand the emotional mechanics at play, both yours and theirs, before translating anything into behavior. When this step is skipped, people confuse momentum with meaning. They assume intensity equals depth or attention equals connection. But real emotional shifts are slower than that. They unfold through consistency, not emotional spikes. Asterisk when you allow the noticing to remain observational without forcing definition, you often learn something important. Either the feeling stabilizes into genuine connection, or it dissolves once uncertainty resolves. Both outcomes provide clarity. What matters is not rushing to collapse the experience into a conclusion. Because when you start noticing someone, more than before, what you are really noticing is a change in yourself. Your priorities are shifting. Your emotional sensitivity is tuning toward something meaningful. Asterisk handled well. This awareness increases clarity rather than confusion. Handled poorly, it creates pressure, projection, and unnecessary emotional risk. The difference lies in whether you allow the process to reveal itself or attempt to control it before it has fully formed. This is why noticing someone more often feels meaningful before it feels clear. And this is why the most grounded response is not immediate action. It is understanding. Understanding what the noticing is actually pointing toward. Understanding how uncertainty fuels attention. Understanding the difference between a feeling that is growing and a feeling that is simply unresolved. That distinction changes everything. Once you see it, you stop reacting to the feeling and start reading it. This is where deeper awareness begins, a point often emphasized by Dr. Sophia in discussions about emotional perception and internal shifts. Asterisk. This is usually where people misread what is happening, not because they do not feel the shift, but because they try to interpret it too literally. When attention changes, the instinct is to look for obvious signals, clear interest, and direct confirmation. But attraction rarely announces itself that way, especially in its early stages. It appears through quieter behaviors that do not register as signals at first, only as a sense that something feels different. Asterisk, for many men, this is where uncertainty quietly grows. You can sense that something has shifted, but you cannot fully explain why. The attention is there, the energy feels warmer. Yet the clarity you expect never fully arrives. That is often because the signs are not loud. They are indirect, contextual, and easy to miss if you are only watching for obvious interest. Asterisk, understanding how attraction actually shows itself changes the entire experience. It removes guesswork and replaces it with awareness. Not so you can force outcomes, but so you stop misreading what is already happening. That is what the next discussion explores. The subtle ways attraction tends to reveal itself, often in places men are not taught to look. And how awareness, when guided thoughtfully, as Dr. Sophia often explains, becomes a tool for clarity rather than confusion.